Hi, and welcome to another episode of Clash Course, where I will once again utterly obliterate whatever opinion Joey happens to bring to the table. My co-host, Joey Livingston, that is. If you've been following the last several weeks, we've been discussing the monogamy versus non-monogamy dynamic in a sense of is it or people should be monogamous is the position that Joey was trying to take, and he no longer even wants to try to continue defending his position. So we're going to move on from that. And today, at least at the beginning, we're doing a little bit more of a meta show today, talking about the show. I will be going on vacation. I'll be missing the next 2 Sundays following this one. So we don't want to get committed into anything too heated today on Clash Course or to something that we'll want to continue for too long. So Joey had suggested a few weeks ago that we talk a little bit more about how we approach the show and the arguments that we make. He said, I think that we should spend some time talking about the way we do this. And I said, I think it's I like to approach it as a dialectic, sort of a Socratic method, which we both kind of scoffed at because in reality that's not how we actually approach the show. But I do hope in the end that those watching the show are considering it in such a way, even though Joey and I are ruthlessly trying to overturn the other person's argument with whatever sneaky underhanded trick we can do to win. In the end, I hope that whoever is watching or possibly even contributing in the future is watching the show with it in their minds that they're sort of weighing the two arguments to see if they can come up with a greater understanding of the actual truth. I'm assuming that that's about at least 98% of the time agreeing with me. So, Joey, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. I want to start this discussion by saying that, and I don't want to be unfair about this because I think that's the same of you. That I really don't agree that we use every dirty trick possible to undermine each other's arguments. I don't think that you really believe that either. I think you're half joking, but I think that I don't think that you do that. I don't think I do that. I think that the one possible thing that could be construed as a trick is when we, or at least I sometimes will start a show with. I'll use the method that sometimes. Journalistic outlets use where they will use a headline that's a little baiting. And as far as what I mean by that headline, well, we'll find out. But I'm not being insincere about it. It's probably the best example is the show where I said that I could prove that we came from a conscious and willful creator, and you accused me of being a little tricky there. And I don't mind you saying that, but I was very sincere about that show, and I have completely let go of what used to be the cornerstone of my life, which is the Bible. I used to believe that the Bible was infallible, and I wanted to know it so that I could understand life. And then there came a time when it was obvious that the only rational thing to do was to throw it out. But there's still something in me that believes that we come from something, that we come from an intentional designer. And I look out in the universe and I struggle to see that. And this was just one view of something that I saw. And I thought that it would be interesting to share. And I do view it as something special that our world has come alive, and the consciousness of the people on this earth has a will of its own, and we have the ability to shape it. And I view that in a sense as I won't use the term God, but as something conscious and willful. And so it wasn't my intention to be tricky, just interesting. That's all.
Fair enough. And I still submit that it was relatively tricky because we said that we were going to approach that show to discuss whether or not people should believe in a God. And you just said, I won't use the term God. But hey.
I did admit that after we were done. but at the same time, that is something that I sincerely struggle with. It wasn't as if I'm going to call it God to be tricky, but it's something that in my life, as I've walked away from traditional theism, I've struggled with the usage of that term because when you talk about a conscious and willful creator, that is almost always the term that's used but it has so much baggage, and I go back and forth as to whether to use it or not. In fact, I'm just this week I worked on a song that I've been working on for a year and a half, and since I wrote the words to the song, my beliefs have changed. But the song is abstract enough to where I still enjoy the spirit of it. And I went ahead and continue to work on it, and I'm going to finish it and put it out, even though it uses the term God in it. And the song is called The Heart of God. But it's a very abstract idea in the song. And so, but again, I'm not trying to trick anybody into thinking that I believe in the God of Christianity.
That's interesting. I'd love to delve into that more someday on what you actually do believe into, but maybe I'll have to have you on Inspiring Honesty for that one, because that's not really a topic I'd like to debate so much as just learn more about, because I do find that interesting. I did want to say, I guess sort of off topic, but on the topic of misleading headlines, I saw a headline earlier today. I think you might appreciate this one. It says, huge black bear wanders onto dance floor in crowded, loud bar in Colorado. Everyone was so drunk that nobody noticed. Eventually, a man yelled at it, and it followed him out the door like a dog. Turns out, in reality...
That was a headline?
Well, that was somebody...
It'd be funny if the actual article was like 4 words long.
Right. It was like, yeah, that kind of happened. This is a headline or a title somebody put on Reddit, but when you actually read the story, the bear wandered in through the back door, through an empty dance floor, and a guy watched it happen as it was approaching the handful of people that were at the bar. Guy was out on the street, watched this happen, came inside and yelled to let the people know that the bear was coming, and the bear turned around and left. It was the most misleading headline I've ever read in my life. I'm like, whoa, that's a really cool story. I could just get in a visual of a guy walking in. There's this bear on the dance floor. It was like, hey, look at this thing. And like, hey, get out of here, you. Shoot.
But don't the stories that affect us personally seem to us, I mean, most of the time we embrace the stories that we are first person in that story, that they affect us in a big way if something remotely exciting happens. And sometimes we tell a story and we're accused of exaggerating, and it's not as if, I'm not saying we don't exaggerate, but I'm saying that sometimes exaggeration is an expression of how big it was to us, and we want other people to feel the gravity of what we felt.
I completely agree. I think that there's also a large degree that comes in the corruption of eyewitness testimony, because people, when they try to put their memory into language, are trying to convey more than just the objective, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, but also how it made them feel, their reactions, their thoughts. And of course, they're bringing their own life experience into that, and their perception of these things is altered outside of their conscious awareness. So it certainly is very, very true that does happen, yes.
Yeah. And I don't necessarily view exaggeration as misleading, depending on the context. I mean, if in the case that you're talking about, an eyewitness account, it is important that the people who are giving the account, even though they often don't, it's important for them to try to be as objective and as unemotional as possible, and just recount what actually happened in a very bland way. But when it comes to the context of a storyteller, somebody who's conveying an experience that they went through, and it's for the purpose of entertaining a crowd, I don't fault them for exaggeration. I think that's the creative right of a writer. Now, you may argue that they're fictionalizing it to some extent, but at the same time, you could argue that the way that they're using those words, that it did actually happen that way. They're just being very artistic about about their choice of words.
I'd say that they're sensationalizing, which I applaud when you're a storyteller. I mean, or even jokes. The greatest jokes in the world can be absolutely killed if you don't know how to tell them. And some of the greatest ways to tell, particularly narrative jokes, is to put them in the first person and tell them as if it happened to you.
Right.
There's just no other way. Yes, you're fictionalizing it. Admittedly, jokes are frequently fictional to begin with, but you're right. Stories are best when retold from a first person perspective, and when they're told in a way that has the visual imagery and gets people to experience the situation themselves. So I guess the reason that I brought up the eyewitness testimony is because people are trained far more at being storytellers than at being objective observers, accurately recounting factually what happened. And it actually gets beyond to the point where their memory works like a storyteller, and they don't necessarily even think that they're telling a story when they believe they're objectively recounting fact after fact. It's more a their recollection itself has been skewed, or their perception in the moment is skewed by this. So when it is stored into their memories, it's already altered in such a way, and that's been shown time and time again with all
Sure.
kinds of
Well,
studies.
yeah. I mean, I don't know if you listen to This American Life like I do, or actually no, it was Radio Lab. Do you ever listen to Radio Lab?
No, can't say I do.
Okay, well, it's another NPR program, but they were talking about some experiments that they did on memory, and I won't go into detail because I will probably tell it wrong, as the story actually shows, and how memory works. But the long and the short of it was that they discovered, or at least they think they discovered, that every time a person remembers something, it almost on a physical level changes that memory within their mind. Every time they reprocess that memory, and that and every time they do it, the more they remember it, the more they remember a story over and over again, the memory actually changes.
Yes, yeah, that's really interesting to read about that and to see. I do remember seeing that as well. But it also makes a lot of intuitive sense when you think about our tendency to exaggerate to small degrees, but then of course the exaggerations that we've told in the past are interpolated back into our memories, so that a small exaggeration the next time would of course be, at least potentially, an exaggeration of the exaggerated
Right.
degree that you started with. So, and that, of course, exaggeration and minimization of the things that, specifically if you're telling stories, don't get the same reaction from the crowd. I mean, if I look at stand-up comedians, they try out their jokes on small crowds and prune them from the act if they don't hit like they're supposed to well before it ever makes it to the big venues.
Sure.
So I think our memories work much the same way. We are products of reinforcement.
Do you think that that formal debate, like when people really try to debate in the strictest of fashion, do you think it's productive?
It depends on what the goal is. And I guess to clarify that, I don't think that two people debating in a very strict fashion is valuable for either of them in any way other than simply understanding their own argument better and refining it and gaining practice in defending it. I think that that's the goal of a debate, is to defend your argument or to attack your opponents, not to learn something. And that's where I think that the dialectic
I
sort
don't.
of comes
You know, I've
about.
watched a lot of formal debates, and I rarely feel like I even learn anything.
Well, I think that it might be your choice of what debates to watch. Debates
Maybe
are a
so.
very good thing to watch to introduce yourself to some of the controversial aspects of a topic and some of the common criticisms of it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good broad field sample about the topic, nor is it a representative sample of what everybody thinks about it. You're sort of going to get the two extremes on it, or at least one extreme on it, and one mainline position that is defending it. And we also have to recognize that the more extreme or the more one-sided the extremity becomes, where say we have a young Earth creationist going against a evolutionary biologist, the young Earth creationist has spent their or devoted a huge amount of their time to learning about how to debate this topic, whereas the evolutionary biologist just understands the topic to a great degree, and they don't necessarily have the same rhetorical skills. So that is certainly something to recognize when we watch these debates as well, is the practice that somebody has in debate. It's an art form.
Yeah. I guess my head is full of presidential debates.
Those two presidential debates, I don't feel like we ever really learn anything because they don't even answer the questions.
Yeah.
they just get or use it as a time to stump for a while, I guess.
Yeah, and there's very, very, very rarely do they commit to anything. I guess maybe I'm coming from a standpoint of political debates, not just presidential, but political debates. That generally happens. Neither party really commits; they just try to undermine the other party.
I think though that's true for the most part for the bigger, more publicized debates, because when you get to the national scale, these things they're almost a cult of personality at that point. But if you get into local ones or something that has a good moderator, because that's key. If you have a formal debate, you need to have a skilled moderator to control the topics and to ask probing questions and to make sure that they are staying on topic. And you just don't run into that as much in the presidential debates or the national debates. But in the local ones, people honestly, I think, are going into it as if it's a debate and not an opportunity to stump. So the ones that I've seen have been far more productive than the ones that are televised.
Yeah. You asked me, or you said earlier that one day you'd like to spend some time, talking to me about what I believe. Don't you think that that's an easier discussion to have with somebody? I mean, at least with a theist who, has a textbook that they believe from.
It certainly is. However, even that is difficult for an atheist, because I approach the understanding that theists have of, this is my textbook, in a rather objective sense, and say, that's great. Your textbook has over like 4,000 known interpretations and 15 different English translations that are commonly used. So I can't even, I don't even know where to start. I'd need to ask which text or which version of this textbook are you using, and which tradition are you coming from, and how strictly do you adhere to this? What kind of family have you come from? Where are you the kind of, for example, are you a pro-choice feminist Catholic? Because that would really change a lot of my understanding of how you approach your Bible reading, as opposed to being a anti-abortion, pro-male as the head of the household Catholic, because both exist. So just saying I'm Catholic and this is my book still doesn't tell me that much.
Do you think that it's okay for a theist not to believe anything or much specific?
I do. I mean, I really can't criticize. Well, I shouldn't say that. I can criticize all I want, and I do. As far as in the scope, though, of somebody who is a theist, I really can't say that a limited belief and a rather amorphous belief is worse than a more specific and more dogmatic belief. I'd have to argue that it's better.
That's really where I am. I mean, theism has become a very exploratory process for me. I don't, I guess I've experienced enough of clinging to a specific that I can't prove to want to go through that again. And just because I have a sense that we came from something intentional, um, doesn't mean I can prove it. It doesn't mean that I'm going to try and prove it. But when I see something that I think I can observe, I certainly want to explore it. And I think that's what I was doing on that show, was just exploring an idea that I had. And um, and I think I did a damn good job of showing that in that sense we come from something conscious and willful. But just because that in any sense is true doesn't mean that there's not something bigger. It's just something that I saw.
What's
Um,
interesting about that particular show is that in the end, when I kind of finally came around to understanding where you were coming from with it, it turned out that you were making an argument that I very commonly make, because I'm an ardent socialist and talk all the time about how individualism is a ridiculous mentality because we are social animals that are a product of society and culture and have been raised in this world that we stand on the shoulders of giants, as it were.
sure,
And none of us are growing up in a vacuum. So, absolutely, I make the argument all the time that we come from something greater than ourselves. I don't generally give it a distinction of conscious and willful, but in the ways that we interpreted those for that show, it certainly fit with my argument. So I just found that really interesting as we got to the end of it, is that um, it was something that I could find myself identifying very
sure.
strongly with in that.
Well, I appreciate that and respect it, because I feel like that at least some atheists that I've spoken with um, really miss out on some some things in this universe that certainly seem to have a life of their own, and there's a sort of magic to them. And when I use the word magic, I'm talking about things that surpass our understanding, and things that can destroy us if there's just a slight shift in the way that this universe is working, um, but currently benefit us and sustain us, and things that we have no control over. And it's amazing that we live in this um, pocket. If there is no God, if there is no creator, and we come from randomness, as Alan Darley's guest postured this morning, um, wow, what amazing odds we exist in. I mean, there are infinite possibilities that this universe could go in if it exists in pure unintentional chaos. And for us to be here in the midst of that, and for things to exist in such a way to where we have, it seems like we have no control, and yet if we understand the things around us, we can gain an amazing amount of control, at least compared to the average individual who takes part in this world. If we just come to have an education about how this, we'll call it chaos for now, how this chaos works, how it's structured, that we can actually harness it in amazing ways. And I do find that amazing. I mean, I certainly admit, if there is no creator, if there is a creator, he's a genius. If there is no creator, it's still amazing.
And I have to agree with that. I mean, it's something I've never denied the possibility of there being some sort of creator. I simply believe that the belief in it is, or in one, is not a currently justified or justifiable belief based on the evidence that we have. I maintain the default null hypothesis on that one. And I either way though, I recognize how incredible and complex the world and the universe are. I mean, I can tell you that I've never had an experience that I would describe as religious, and I'll get to that language here in a second. But the most powerful moments of my life, as far as the awe-inspiring, overwhelming moments, have been things like up at my family cottage in Eagle River and laying down on the dock at 2 o'clock in the morning and looking up at the sky and seeing it's a meteor shower going on, and I had the aurora borealis going on over there, and there's just so many stars, and it was incredible. It was amazing. Or walking through the rainforest in Costa Rica and being in the middle of the heart of protected rainforest where tourists are not allowed. We were with a biology class, and it was raw forest that was just overwhelming in the color, or the cloud forest that was there, where everything is green and lush, and very much like the Highlands of Scotland. When I first lifted my eyes up from the book I was reading, which was actually Richard Dawkins' The Greatest Show on Earth, which is a book that talks about all the amazing things that happen in nature, specifically in biology. And I looked up from that book, and I literally choked up because it was just such a breathtakingly beautiful thing to see, with all of the glens and the hills and the mountains, the little tiny waterfalls coming down everywhere in the Highlands of Scotland. So yeah, there are really things that blow me away and that are just amazing to me
I agree.
and awe-inspiring.
Can I ask you a question?
Mm-hmm.
In a world where observably life comes from life, and intelligent life comes from intelligent life, and intelligence creates intelligence, why is intelligence any less of a null position than accident?
Well, I think that it's that way that question is being phrased is begging the question a bit. But for
How so?
example, flying life comes from flying life, and
Sure.
the swimming life comes from swimming life as well. But that's looking again on an observable scale. If we look back on a scale that humans are not capable of existing on, but we are capable of interpreting evidence on, we can see that flying life actually came from swimming life, as did walking life and intelligent life. At some point, this is we spent a good amount of time in the last show, or a few times it was mentioned, the fallacy of the heap, where just because we can't denote a specific moment where something goes from unintelligent to intelligent doesn't mean that there isn't one, nor that the gradient is something that should be discarded or unrecognized. I mean, even within humans, we can't just say intelligence, because there's a huge variety of different kinds of intelligences and different ability levels and different general levels of intelligence or unintelligence that happen within the human species. So there's wherever there's variety that exists, there can be selection, and that has been historically the case as well. So what we do have, though, as far as the intelligence, or why intelligence is a less justified null hypothesis than unintelligence, is because all that we have for evidence in nature is natural forces. There are essentially four forces at work in the universe: the strong and weak nuclear forces, magnetism, and gravity. And anything that is not within the scope of those four forces is a construct of those four forces. So that's I don't know if I really answered the question in that one, but it's the reason it is a more justified null hypothesis to begin with, that the universe, or that life as it stands in the universe today, came from a simpler state and developed into what it is through some sort of chaotic fluctuations, is because that's, as far as we can tell, how every level of complexity that exists has come about
Sure.
throughout time.
So, do you think that this bubble that we live in has always existed?
And that's an interesting question because I think that always is a term that denotes time, and time appears to be dependent upon the current organization of our universe. So it's entirely possible that this universe has existed in some way before it existed in the way that it currently is, before the Big Bang. But even the term before the Big Bang is nonsense. There's no such thing because time as we know it is dependent upon the Big Bang. That's when time started. So it's a
How
difficult
how do you
question.
define time? When you
Um,
say that, how do you define time?
I I don't I don't really know the physics definition of time, but I I'm using that one as I mean I don't know how it's phrased, but to say that time is dependent upon the universe is something that is a very standard part of the current cosmological models of physics.
So do you believe that our language is incapable of describing the um, events that occurred before the Big Bang?
Potentially, I think potentially our minds are incapable of understanding it. Or even understanding the context in which it comes. I mean, Nick Albertini offers a great example with his holographic projection understanding of the multiverse, in that our universe is actually the portion of another universe that's been sucked into a black hole. And that is perfectly plausible. That would explain a an origin point, a Big Bang of some sort. So we could then say the universe that came before ours, or that ours originated from, on the other side of that black hole. But we then are approaching once again an infinite regress. So the only way that we can really answer this question is to say that either the universe spontaneously came from nowhere, or the universe has always existed in some shape or another, some form or another. And I really don't know if we can justifiably make a distinction to that. As far as by in this sense, I'm saying universe as far as multiverse or whatever we're recognizing as that which exists in everything. Either needed to perpetually have existed in some form or another, or it needs to have started because of something,
All right.
or because of nothing.
So
Just
so I'm
spontaneously
glad
start.
I'm glad that that even though you are arguing that our language is limited, and that to describe it in terms of time is probably not adequate, that you are still doing so, because um, it would be a shame for us not to try to, to look at that moment in our minds and use the best language that we possibly can to communicate to one another, what we feel this is all about. Because I can certainly accept that, um, you know, what was before this universe possibly escapes the language of time. But nevertheless, I wonder about it, and I wonder, if this universe has always been here, why and how, and what from, and if it has always been here, then is there something outside of always from which it came?
It's such a difficult question for, again, I don't even necessarily think it's our language, but our minds that are incapable of it.
I think that's
Humans,
where
I forget who it was. There's a evolutionary biologist, I think it may have even been Dawkins, who talked about us being beings of, I think it was like middling beings, that was the terminology used, but essentially that we have an incredibly difficult time even conceptualizing the understandings of minute, tiny things like the quantum scale, or incredibly large, massive things like infinity. It's just something outside of the human ability for the most part. I mean, there's some that have a better grasp of it than others, but because it is such a foreign concept to our ability to perceive things that are tangible and large in this way and act the way that we expect them to act, and yet limited in both time and scope. It's just difficult for anybody to conceptualize what eternity or infinity
Sure.
means
Sure.
because we just don't have a frame of reference that even talks about
Sure.
it. So I think likewise, before time is just as nonsensical to the human scope.
Sure. But nevertheless, our minds wonder about it, and certainly mine does. And I think that's where my theism hangs on, not in the sense of, Jehovah's got to be somewhere, but in the sense of saying, I can imagine the Big Bang being an accident. Okay, I can even imagine the thing that set the Big Bang in motion, so to speak, being an accident. But where do the accidents stop? Is there was there constantly cause and effect? I mean, is it, as you say, an infinite regress, and is there no intelligence in that chain until us? Really? That's so hard for me to.
Well, and I don't think anybody's really speculating that there's no intelligence in that chain until us. It's just a intelligence that we are aware of until us. There could very well have been intelligence other places in the universe or in previous universes or multiverses.
But I specifically mean something along the line that actually decided to set this in motion.
Well, theoretically, we could be part of a intentionally created universe by some sort of
okay, great.
being.
But isn't that just the language that we're using to wonder, to imagine? Just because we call it a simulation because we have computers doesn't mean that specifically describes what happened. It's just our struggle to put it in terms we can understand.
That's absolutely accurate. But the point that I'm making with that is that even if we were to discover that our entire universe is indeed a simulation, or it is a physical universe, not even a simulation, but it's created by a being or an entity powerful enough to create the universe, something that we would theoretically call God. I mean, it would fit every aspect, something that interacts and tinkers with our universe, so that our universe is a big giant ant farm in that respect. Then great. Okay, so we've proven the origin of our universe, but that still
I know where you're going, and I totally agree. Where did that come? Who created him? And I think that's why it's so. I think that's why Christians find peace in just settling, well, he's always existed.
That's where I take my.
I'm not saying that they have any way of knowing that, and I'm not saying that we have any way of knowing what we're talking about here. But I'm just saying, surely, theists and atheists have in common the inability not to imagine, and perhaps theists are more prone to take their imagination and say, this is real, this is actually what happened. But I think that there is a rational, at least as rational of a null position as the accidental null position. I know that's toying with the idea of null a little bit because null is null, but I'm arguing that I don't think that accidental is purely null. And I think that there is a rational view of intelligent origin that is just as null. There's nothing here that I can prove, but my mind grasps at the idea of just trying to understand how can we have an infinite regression of accidents, and many, as you have stated, scientists who are not theists have postured that we're in some sort of simulation, and I say, if that's the word you want to use, fine. Of course we are in some sort of simulation, because on some level what we go through isn't real. It's just a story. And I mean, from on some level, that is the perspective. What goes on in our lives doesn't affect everything in this universe like it does right here. And on some level, it is just virtually inconsequential. So, of course, in some senses, it is a simulation. And if it's a simulation, I just I have a hard time not imagining a simulator. And I'm okay with that, but it's interesting to note that scientists postulate this because it's very hard to keep going back and back and back and just believe that none of this has intention.
I want to make one quick distinction: is that scientists don't postulate it; they conject it more so. That it's
okay. Okay.
But they're saying, well, wouldn't that be interesting? It's potentially possible. They're not by any means saying that that's the case.
Well, now what I had heard, and I agree that nobody is saying we know that this to be true, but I heard much more than just, oh, wouldn't it be interesting? I mean, I heard an argument that that the odds were quite high from a particular argument that we were in a simulation. And I don't know whether I agree with that argument or not, but the way that it was the way that it was pitched in general was much more than just somebody writing a fictional book. It was somebody saying that actually the odds are much higher that we're in a simulation than we are actually in reality.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I think I may be familiar even with what you're talking about. There was also some people that recently came up with a way to test that theory. I don't understand it.
I don't either.
It's something that just went over my head. It's some very high level physics to get to where they were going, but they were trying to test whether we're actually in part of some sort of simulation, or if our universe is not. I think that it's probably begging the question to some extent for them to even come up with a theory of what the simulation would have to be like. Because obviously for them to think about it, if they were within the simulation, that would mean that has to be somehow a product of the simulation and therefore could have been accounted for. Either way. I think, though, in the end, it comes down to, or the primary difference is, you're right. Atheists do still have these thoughts, and we chew on these ideas, but in my mind, in the minds of other atheists, they're questions, and they're questions without answers at this point. The best and most honest answer, as we see it, is I don't know.
Sure.
And when we go from I don't know to I believe, there's a problem. So what I can say is I'm an atheist because I do not believe that there's a God. I don't necessarily, it's a default belief. I do believe that there is no God, but it's a default null hypothesis, that it's not something that I am, well, I can't even say that. I am actually convinced pretty securely that there's no such thing as a God by most traditional understandings and definitions of that term.
Sure.
Because everything that I've ever seen and all of my experience,
but I'm not talking about
all
the
of
specific.
humanity's experience.
I'm not talking about the specific. I'm just talking about the just looking out in the universe and having the ability to see everything around us and conclude and have a leaning, not even conclude, have a leaning, a feeling, what's the word I'm looking for? Just a
hope.
A notion.
Hope.
That your leaning is that everything that you look around, when you look around, everything that you see comes from nothing intelligent. It's hard for me to imagine that on some level that most people don't at least lean towards saying, wow, I don't believe in God by, as you say, by any definition, but how can all this be? And at no level there be some intention that set this in motion.
Well, and while you may not understand it, that is certainly where I come from. And I will say this, though.
That is your leaning.
Yep.
Okay.
I lean that it is a product of physical forces that we don't fully understand. I don't know where it came from, but I certainly do not lean towards there being any sort of intention. And primarily that comes from the rather specific, even if there was intention on our scale of the universe, that still, it just adds another link in the regressive chain beforehand. So at some point, we either
Yes.
need to say that something can and did spontaneously come from nowhere with no explanation, or has
Yes.
always
Either
existed.
way, the
And
idea of the infinite is seemingly undeniable. I agree that if we ever were to find some intention in this chain, our minds would certainly ask, well, what before that?
right, well, and that's what I mean is that we have to at some point just assign something as the first, whether that means it's always existed or it has um, it came into existence spontaneously and with no cause. That is a logical tautology, that it has to be true by the way that we define these things, and therefore we're faced with a choice, and the choice is to look at the universe as we see it now, or even potentially, if some of the things that Nick and the physicists that believe in sort of M theory have postulated, uh, they lead us to believe that there are other universes, a multiverse of
Sure.
sorts. Then we end up in the situation where we have to assign that
Right.
which we can identify as really existing and empirically verify to be either the first thing that came
Right.
about
Or something else
spontaneously
is the
or has always
first.
existed, or something else. And I think that or something else is simply an unjustified creation. It's a manifestation of our inability to grasp or to cope with things coming from sort of where they come now. And I can say one final point on this is that some things may not be pleasant to imagine. As a matter of fact, there are things that are unimaginably unpleasant that we also know are true. There's people who rape and kill children.
Okay, but we're not talking about horrible.
Oh,
We're
no,
talking.
but what I'm saying is it's a horrible, horrible thing that if you were to not be aware that it's true, you couldn't even imagine it being true. It's there are things out there that are just uh, unimaginably bad, and in many people's minds, the idea of coming from nothing, the nihilistic understanding of the universe, is that degree of horrifying,
Okay, but
and
I don't
and
feel
I
that
think that
way.
it's hope and
This
it's
is me
wishful
and you
thinking.
talking. I don't feel that way. I know we are in a sense exploring everybody's ideas, but this is me, and I don't find it horribly unimaginable that we come from nothing. I find it, you know, I mean, as somebody who's not a scientist and not a mathematician, I still have to say that I find it mathematically and scientifically impossible to conceive within whatever abilities I have in those fields, which are not great, but nevertheless, it is me. And when you talk about the first thing, whatever's first, my first question is, and when did that thing set everything in motion, and why, and was that an accident, and did it have no life? We are at the end of the show. We are literally out of time. I'm going to consume the last word since I have given it to you in the past. Will you let me have it?
You are welcome to it.
Okay, thank you, sir. That was my last word, and we will see you next time on Clash Course. We hope you enjoyed this. Greg and I didn't want to get into anything that we would have to continue on the next show, though it was a very, very interesting discussion, and perhaps we will continue it on the next show. Anyways, we'll see you. Greg's going to be gone for a couple of Sundays, and then if nobody jumps in to take his place, we won't be having a Clash Course for the next 2 weeks, but we will be back, so stick with us.